Hi, it's very nice to be here with you. Welcome. It's been a little while. This was a tricky subject for me to broach, mainly because it took me some time to think about what did I really want to say to you here? What did I really believe is our situation? And I've come down to the belief that when we talk about UFOs or UAP, we talk about our current efforts to understand this phenomenon, which continues around us every day. There's always more news going on about it, whether it's continued drone or orb sightings in different parts of the world that remain fascinating and unexplained, or the current efforts for what we might call disclosure, or to be more modest about it, transparency about UAP, whatever. It strikes me that we are still, in our public discourse, still taking baby steps here. And it's not even our fault that this is the case. First of all, the UFO subject, I'm going to say UFO for a while here, is a difficult subject. It's a challenging subject because, frankly, what it looks like is that we are dealing with an intelligence that is highly sophisticated, that's got its own game plan, and that's probably operating, certainly seems to be operating levels beyond ourselves. So that's one problem. And then the other problem is that we are dealing with a governing body around the world, the United States and other countries, where they are also not being particularly open to us, we the people, about what they may know and what their interactions have been. So from our point of view, from those of citizen investigators, citizen journalists, or just plain old interested people who want to know about this, we are hampered by a lot of things, a lot of illusions. And that's really the main theme that I want to hit on in this talk here is essentially the UFO cover-up in a world of illusions. All kinds of illusions. We live under an illusion of freedom, for starters. And I'm not saying we have no freedoms. We do. But we also live under illusions and delusions about our freedom. I've come to think that this delusion seriously hampers our ability to understand a lot of things. I mean, not just the nature of the true structure of power in our society, but many, many things about our society, about the nature of our world, in fact, and particularly when it comes to the UFO or UAP phenomenon, what is beyond that veil? What is there? This idea that we think we're free, that we think we have access to information, that we think we can affect all of the changes that we think we want to make. I'm starting to think maybe not so much. You look back through history, it becomes very clear that pretty much all societies have been intensely hierarchical and as tightly controlled as possible under the circumstances allotted to them. Now, I'm not even going to say whether this is right or wrong. It is what it is. To ask that the long path of human history to have turned out any other way than it did somehow strikes me as a bit naive or maybe even foolish. We are who we are for reasons, not all of which we even understand all out well. Personally, I think a good portion of our misunderstandings about ourselves comes from that delusion that we actually are particularly free. And also another delusion, which I'll just talk about as an aside, and then I'm going to move on and get back into the main event, which is really the reality of the UFO phenomenon. But the delusion of the notion of progress, I think that is a real delusion. I may come back to this one in the future, but basically I think there is truth, certainly, to technological and scientific progress. We can see it all around us. But I've come to feel that there's a couple of other mistakes that we have about this idea of progress. First, that assuming progress is naturally good. I think putting a valuation on that is probably unwise. It's a kind of reflexive attitude that many of us have. You know, old is bad, the new must be good, newer is better than old. Not so sure about that. I'm not sure that's the right way to think about it. And secondly, I think there's a mistake in assuming that progress involves the granting of ever more rights and freedoms to human beings. We definitely associate that. I've spent most of my life with that association as well. Thinking about it now, I seriously doubt that it's true, and I doubt that that the reality of that can actually be sustained in the way that some people seem to think it can. That is, as we keep going, more and more rights, more and more freedoms, better and better and better and better for people. I somehow don't think that's actually realistic. But I want to come back to that further at another time. For right now, I would just say that the public, especially in Western nations, but really worldwide, has been led to believe that they live in genuinely open, democratic societies where their voices and their votes matter. And again, I'm not saying they don't matter at all, but I am saying that I think we really overestimate how much they do matter. And when we think about our societies in these ways, we end up having unrealistic ideas about the nature of things like UFO disclosure. Perfect example, go back to the 1950s. I love studying the history of this. So back then, in America particularly, this was the period when Americans really believed in their system and in the ability of Congress, for example, to get to the bottom of this phenomenon, and that the proper way is to bring the subject to Congress where the representatives will vote on it and do the right thing for the American people and all that. This really was what a lot of people believed. And you think about it, UFO secrecy means one thing if you are the citizen in what you believe is a free and open democratic society. But it means something very different if you somehow think or come to understand that you live in an authoritarian or indeed a totalitarian society. You might think of different strategies for disclosure if that's something you believed in, if you lived in that type of society. So what we believe about our societies matters quite a lot. And I think that this belief of the West, particularly as some open, democratic society, is an illusion very carefully crafted by those who have great power. I think in reality, we're looking at a very small group of elites, which has always controlled human societies and which continues to control most of our society even today. And I think over the last few centuries, we can say that these individuals with overwhelming amount of power have become more and more clever at manipulating events and information to maintain their domination. We can put it that way. So I think this deception is deeply ingrained in our societal structures. I mean, really, who doubts any longer that true power in our world is not with our elected officials? I mean, we all kind of realize it's not with them, but with far more powerful people and groups that operate behind the scenes. Let's call them the elites. Now, since you know that I've studied UFOs or UAP for 30 years, some of you know that, you might not be surprised to hear me say that these elites have many points of connection to the UFO phenomenon, and indeed, maybe even to extraterrestrial influences. I'll come back to that. But meanwhile, I think it's fair to say that they have created a system where the public is led to believe that it has power through voting and through public discourse, when in fact major decisions are always made in secret by a select few. And this really matters when we start to look at the evidence of a UFO reality, of a cover-up, and especially of the implications of an advanced group of beings that surely seem to be here in our world, engaging in activities that are important to them, without any genuine public discussion on our part. Well, we go on living in these illusory information bubbles we've created for ourselves and which have also been created for us. It's just not a very good recipe for effective action, it seems to me. And when we are dealing with so much obfuscation coming from our own elites, let's call them that, we're not even beginning to grasp the obfuscation that we may be getting from these beings or the veils behind which they exist. So all of that. So this illusion, I guess, illusion of democracy, as I have here on this slide, it's maintained through, it's a very sophisticated kind of illusion. There's media control, education systems, carefully orchestrated political theater. All of these are part of it. And there's much more than that too. But so controlling information in this day and age is not necessarily even easy, since we all do have an amazing ability to communicate with each other, very much in ways that never existed in the past. So it makes for a fascinating society that we have with lots of ideas, lots of stimulation. That's the world the internet has allowed us to make. But because of that very amazing freedom and potential, it also makes information control even more important. And I'll get into that in just a moment, but I'll just mention a little bit about education very briefly, and I'm going to move on. The education system, to my perspective, looks worse and worse at every level as the years go by. I'm not trying to dunk on young people currently going through grade school or university. That was me once. But I often feel for them in terms of how badly most of them are getting ripped off by a substandard teaching system that really looks nothing other than a Soviet-style bureaucracy to my eyes. Because basically it's a system that teaches one thing: how to conform. You look at young people leaving the school system these days, and they're great at that. They're great at knowing what their peers are supposed to, how they're supposed to dress, how they're supposed to look, what lingo they're supposed to use. They're great at learning how to conform. And the education establishment is all for that. Maybe conformity is necessary. You could look at society in that way, but at the same time, it's fostering the illusion that we actually have power, that we actually can do anything. We can be free thinkers even. So people come out of this system thinking that they have a genuine understanding of life and of reality, when in fact, we usually know pretty much nothing when we come out of those systems. So it's just another layer of illusion that is foisted upon us, another thing that often hampers more than helps us in our understanding of the more important realities of our world. Elections are the ultimate political theater that we have in our world. I mean, elections are amazing. They're often touted as the pinnacle of democratic participation. Most of the time, in my view, I think they're usually more fake than not. Not every time, there are resistances that happen. Sometimes there are challenges, or what appear to be challenges to the system. But basically, I think candidates in most elections are presented or pre-selected, we could really say, by the elites that stand behind them. So it ensures that whoever really wins, the agendas will always continue. I think that's the basic template. Again, there are periodic challenges to that template. And we're seeing right now what we can call maybe a populist challenge to the system. It's certainly, you can see it in many spaces on social media. Now you can see it in popular discontent. Donald Trump's recent election victory tapped into some of this without question. It's debatable as to how much this is an actual challenge to the system and how much the underlying structure of power in our world will actually give way to a genuine change. There's the question. I would say never underestimate the power of that system to keep doing what it does best, which is to stay in charge. Doesn't mean that there can't be challenges to it, but it's a pretty tough system, and it's been quite resilient for a long time. So this false sense of empowerment is useful because it keeps the population complacent. People believe they're making meaningful choices and that they are affecting change, when in reality, maybe not so much. To a large extent, they're participating in a carefully controlled system designed to maintain the status quo. I just mentioned Trump, but think back to the election of Barack Obama in 2008. That was supposed to be tremendous change. You look back and you can see absolutely not. It was Wall Street controlling things just as they always had. So as we're entering 2025 now. I would just say, let us be aware that this illusion may continue to be perpetuated, not without occasional challenges that make things kind of interesting for us. And so where the current new administration incoming is going to lead us in a few years, I'm not going to make a prediction here. I don't know. I think that there will be some disruptions and there's going to be some continuity there. But throughout, I think we can say technology and media manipulation is going to continue to become ever more sophisticated. So this illusion of freedom of information in our world today, I think, is very carefully maintained through a variety of measures to control and restrict the information space. So again, there's the appearance of openness and transparency. I think the reality is much more constrained. And again, you could say that this might be necessary in a system that tells its people that it's democratic. The last thing that the very powerful are going to do is voluntarily give up real power. So what has happened? Over the last century or more, we have seen through the 20th century a kind of democratic series of movements throughout the entire 20th century, and elites have had to adjust to that. One of these days, I'm going to bring up Carol Quigley's very interesting book, Tragedy and Hope. Quigley is well known as one of the main professors of Bill Clinton when Clinton was at Georgetown way back in the 60s. Quigley wrote a really amazing book. Tragedy and Hope is a quite extraordinary book. And he has a lot to say about this adjustment by the elites to challenges to their control. And how they ensured control of the global financial institutions, global manufacturing, the global information space. Quigley really saw things very, very clearly, in my opinion. And I think this is true, and it's important for us to remember that when you have a system now that is overtly democratic, the problem that those elites have is not allowing power to go to the people, but how to let the people believe that they have power while you're still controlling them and manipulating them. That is literally our system today. And because we don't have a full appreciation of that, it really hampers us in our understanding of the system of government that we actually have. We don't really even have a good name for this system, but it's one in which we are told it's democratic, when in fact, of course, it isn't. So that's a specific type of governance, and we don't really have a good name for it. Just saying. So obviously, a very important way that they have done this is by controlling the flow of information. And this is an ever-changing dynamic. So 150 plus years ago, when newspapers became a big thing, that initially posed a challenge. But that was a challenge that had a solution. Newspapers very quickly were gobbled up by ever larger conglomerates that were part of that very establishment. I mean, you could argue they were always part of that establishment, very likely. But as time went by, newspapers that had been independent kept getting gobbled up more and more and they just became part of these large, huge corporations, to the point that that major representatives of newspapers and other major media regularly attend, Bilderberg meetings every year, the World Economic Forum conferences every year. They're part of that whole thing. They are part of that establishment. And then came internet, another problem. Internet was another problem at first, just like newspapers originally were. But the solution is the same. Eventually, after that initial bumpy ride, when there's genuine inquiry and a genuine of not knowingness of where this is all going to go, eventually you see that control comes over it. And sometimes these elites will use tried and true methods, buy up the companies. And then sometimes you have to try new strategies. Now, algorithms or shadow banning or just massive amounts of propaganda or flooding the information space, all of that just for starters. But it's effective. Now, for the last 30 years or so, I have looked at this development mainly through the lens of a UFO cover-up. But this whole phenomenon is a very broad-based thing, of course. It's not just dealing with UFO information. Governments and powerful institutions that work with them use a variety of these types of tactics to manage the flow of information. I've got some bullet points here. I'll just very quickly describe them for you. So selective release of information through controlled channels. So in the old days, this was through newspapers and network television. Now it's through big tech and through government regulations against so-called misinformation, things like that. Or classifying things. Use of classification systems to withhold sensitive data, whether it's claims of UFO whistleblowers like Bob Lazar or more general whistleblowers like Edward Snowden was. Either way, it doesn't matter. You find that deep national security classifications are a huge obstacle for the public to obtain genuine information about its world. And it goes on to this day. I mean, think about David Grush's statements of the last couple of years now about how information is being withheld from members of Congress or the public and how there's threats and intimidation behind the scenes. So it hasn't stopped. My third bullet here, managing mainstream narrative. This is very critically important. Very careful management of this. We see this with every major event that comes into our lives. 9/11, the financial crash of 2008. A lot of narrative management about that. COVID, my God, that just went through the roof. Ukraine. All kinds of narrative management on all of these major things. Every new enemy is carefully staged managed for our consumption, however that consumption is designed to be. And then you flood the information space with disinformation in order to obscure whatever it is you want to obscure, mainly truths that you don't want out there. This goes right along with the previous point. In other words, it's not just selective portrayal of truth that we're talking about in our world, but outright lies that have their own temporary shelf life. So then when the event is past, sometimes we realize, oh wow, that wasn't true after all. I remember 30 plus years ago with the Gulf War, there was this whole claim about the babies in incubators in Kuwait hospitals that were being murdered by Iraqi soldiers. I mean, it was such a hoax. It was brought to Congress. They brought some young woman who supposedly talked about it. The entire thing was fiction. It was totally made up. But it was very important for riling up the public and getting them to sign on to that war. Or all the lies and misinformation and things you just were not allowed to talk about relating to 9/11. Or remember the COVID lab leak hypothesis. God forbid you talk about the fact that COVID might have leaked out of a lab. It was impossible. And we were told again and again that this misinformation is true. Or the effectiveness of the various vaccines and whatnot, which we now know was never truthfully portrayed to us. But, you know, the shelf life has passed. And I'll guarantee you, finally, when all those people involved in all of those lies are dead and gone, we will begin then to get even more information. But not yet. They're going to wait. It's going to take more time, but it will come. So total management of the information space. And then you got legal restrictions on whistleblowers and leakers. All nations, certainly the United States, has very, very heavy-handed laws against such things, all as a way to control the information space. And then on top of that, just how the government comes after you by surveilling your communications to identify and suppress dissent. Don't think this doesn't happen. There have been discussions and plans for this going now for decades to identify dissenting groups or dissenting opinions and to find ways of infiltrating and diverting them. The United States, the UK, both, we've had leaks. Snowden was very important in getting some of those leaks out. But we've had this in our society for a long time now. You're being watched and your online statements being monitored. And then beyond all of that, we are just looking at again, this is coming out and there's been pushback against this. Fortunately, how far it will go, we'll have to see. But algorithmic manipulation of online information and search results. I don't know to what extent this is going on right now as I speak. I know it's going on to some extent. Is it We're hearing about some of the potential rollbacks of some of these measures. Facebook now is, I think, the latest one. Whether that's going to really make a huge difference or not, we'll have to wait and see. And whether it will be anything more than a bump in the road is another thing. So now, bringing it back to the UFO phenomenon, which is what I want to discuss for the rest of this talk here with you. We have seen the control over the information space in the UFO arena for many decades now. First, extreme compartmentalization. Good example. When Project Blue Book ended back in 1969, it was a long time ago, more than 50 years ago, the public at that time had been conditioned to believe that Blue Book was the sole legitimate UFO investigative body that existed in the entire government. That's what we were told. And then a classified memo a couple of years later ago leaked out, or came out. It was called the Bollinger Memo. The late Stanton Friedman talked about this a lot, rightly so. So General Carol Bollinger, back in 1969, wrote a memo for internal distribution only, stating that, well, the closure of Blue Book's really not very significant because any UFO report that actually affected national security, those are being filed outside the Blue Book system anyway. The first time researchers saw that, they were like, say what? Blue Book was supposed to be the sum total of all UFO reporting, but here was General Carol Bollinger saying, no, not so. There is much more. So there's very compartmentalized information. And this is a very effective way of doing things. Just a little over a decade ago, there was a couple of attempts at online petitions to get the then Obama White House to come clean on its interest in ETs and UFOs. And they did receive a statement back from the Obama White House, which just stated, we don't have any government agencies investigating this. There's no evidence to show that there's anything unusual about the phenomenon, yada, yada, yada. And then we discover a few years later that the ATIP program and the OSAP programs actually were in existence at that very time when the Obama White House issued its denial. They did have a UFO investigative body going on at that very moment when they said they didn't. So compartmentalization is very, very important in managing the UFO information space. Think of something like a document that leaked out fairly recently as well, the Davis-Wilson Notes, which I've been very interested in. I've talked about it quite a lot. I knew when that came out in 2019 that was real and legit. Lots of researchers said it was nonsense, it was fiction. They were wrong. Eric Davis fairly recently openly acknowledged that he was the author of that note. But that note demonstrates, without a doubt, how high-level government officials, in this case Admiral Thomas R. Wilson, had been denied rightful access, as he saw it anyway, to certain UFO reverse engineering programs. Wilson at the time was Deputy Head of Intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, had learned about the alleged existence of black budget UFO reverse engineering programs back in 1997, looked into it, and indeed found more than one, talked to the managers of one of those programs, and they basically slammed the door in his face. He said, well, I'll complain up the chain of command. They said, be our guest. We don't really care. We're not afraid of you. And he did complain, and he was threatened with his career. And 5 years later, talked to Davis about it. So the compartmentalization of the UFO phenomenon is very important, not to be underestimated at all. It's a big, big part of how this subject to this day remains opaque to many of us who are on the outside trying to look in. I mean, if someone of Wilson's stature 25 years ago could not get a peek at this reverse engineering program, what makes us think that ordinary folks like ourselves can, right? Well, but beyond that, other public and elected representatives have been denied access to this phenomenon. We have stories going through decades. Many, many years ago, the late Senator Barry Goldwater, the man ran for president back in the 1960s. talked about being denied access to UFO information at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base by his very close friend, four-star General Curtis LeMay. Goldwater talked about that on a number of occasions, how LeMay, he says, the only time LeMay really ever cussed me out and got angry at me and told me I was just never going to have access to that information there, where bodies allegedly were kept, Goldwater said. Or in the 1990s, New Mexico Congressman Stephen Schiff attempted to obtain information about Roswell through official channels, totally shut down. And now we have more recent statements from current members of Congress, Tim Burchett, Anna Paulina Luna, and others, about how they are continually getting stonewalled by the Pentagon, by the federal government on these matters, not just about what's going on in the areas of things like alien tech and reverse engineering, but in the current situation relating to these so-called mystery drones. They are not satisfied with the answers they're getting. These are elected representatives of the American people. We like to think we have a right to know, but we can see the reality is that officials are denied access. Another way to control the information is to use private contractors, private aerospace contractors and major corporations in order to avoid government oversight and to get around freedom of information requests as well. This has been a tactic used for many decades now. And we've had sources telling multiple researchers over many years about deeply hidden UFO research programs that even high-level military contacts cannot access. This is an old story. We have deliberate campaigns of ridicule and debunking to discredit witnesses. This is another very way to control the information space. It's a little less used now than it used to be. So the ridicule is not nearly as much in effect as it was, but it was only just a decade ago and more that it was the norm. You go back to 1953, we had the Robertson panel, a CIA, classified CIA panel on this subject that made the recommendation, which was followed for years and years, to encourage the debunking of UFOs through mass media, through infiltrating civilian research groups. All of this was openly discussed in this document, in their conclusions. So, and then, there's just examples, alleged but credible, of U.S. military, Air Force particularly, using disinformation against UFO researchers to cover up aspects of this program as well. And then you have intimidation, you have silencing. David Grush has talked about this, talked about a culture of suppression and intimidation, his words, against UAP whistleblowers, including unwarranted criminal investigations and harassment of different types. He was quite open about it. And then saying this, getting smeared in what was obviously a Pentagon orchestrated, intelligence community orchestrated media assault on him for a little while there. You have the weaponization of national security exemptions to withhold documents. In other words, we hear about many declassified UFO documents, but we often don't hear about the huge number of failed FOIA requests that completely overshadow what we have obtained. All of these agencies, the NSA comes mostly to mind here, long history of just heavily redacting UFO files, claiming that all of these deletions were to protect sources and methods, sensitive sources, sensitive methods of acquiring this. It's a great excuse, and I'm sure it's true 5% of the time. And then it's probably not true a lot of the other time. Even recently, I recall John Greenwald discussing how the Arrow organization labeled many documents with, he called a B7 exemption, related to law enforcement investigations as reasons for not disclosing requested documents. It goes on to this day. And then ultimately, because we're not getting the genuine information that the public is requesting, we are ripe for all kinds of disinformation to be flooding our field and muddying the waters. Some of it just from other people and researchers who just put out their own claims, their own predictions, their own alleged inside information that can never be proven one way or the other. And then some of it, I think, very likely with the connivance of the actual authorities, because we know that they've done this with all other types of subjects. Why wouldn't they do it for UFOs as well? So with some UFO information having been released recently, you often hear the allegation, let us say, that this is a very carefully controlled disclosure since 2017 that reveals little of a genuine substance. And to that, I will just continue to say yes and no. I think there is definitely a well-organized attempt to manage and control UFO disclosure. Yes, that's right. But I would only adjust the argument to say that we are looking at an internal factional struggle rather than a carefully managed monolithic plan to just update the cover-up and give it a facelift. There is a plan to update the cover-up and to give it a facelift, but I would argue that that is a response to the initiatives and attempts at getting genuine information out there. That's what I think. So I think that there is a faction that is trying to push this, and I think there's another faction that's got a lot of power and that is able now to use this whole thing to, again, give the cover-up a facelift, make it look a little bit more modern. That's what I think is going on. So what we can all agree on is that the most significant data and evidence still remains hidden behind layers of secrecy, with those in control, I think, showing no genuine willingness toward a full, anything like transparency on this subject. So this is information control, plain and simple. So what's being kept hidden from us? Let's get into it. For 30 years I have studied the history of the UFO phenomenon. So starting very conservatively, there are a few things that I have been saying and coming back to over these many years. Number one, UFOs are real. It's a simple thing to say, but it's just important to get that out there. They represent a real physical phenomenon that has been observed globally for decades, at least for decades. Let's just leave it there for now. Two, they are very advanced technology. These sightings involve objects displaying technology far beyond known human capabilities, whether at the time of their sighting or capabilities today. They're past that. Three, governments take them seriously. There is overwhelming evidence that some governments and military agencies have taken UFOs quite seriously and have investigated them extensively. Four, there's a cover-up. A cover-up of UFO data has existed at high levels, again, for many, many decades of government and military institutions for a long, long time. Five, it involves aliens. There's that word. Call them whatever you want. They're not us. It involves non-human intelligences. In my opinion, probably, but let's just say possibly extraterrestrial, okay? Or maybe interdimensional in nature, if you want to go there, maybe. Maybe both. Why would that be impossible? Why is it impossible that an extraterrestrial civilization has mastered some version of what we would call interdimensionality? Right? Not impossible in my view. Six, there is strong documentation. We have declassified. I mentioned earlier that a lot has not been declassified. That's true. But what has been declassified, there's a lot there. And it provides some of the strongest evidence, in my view, for the reality and significance of UFOs. What got me into this subject many, many years ago is the fact that I started reading declassified military documents where they're describing objects invading sensitive airspace that had no explanation, that were disc-shaped, that could stop, that could take off instantly, that sometimes could zigzag back in the 1940s and 50s. What can do that? what's going to look like a flying saucer, make no sound, evade all attempts at interception, run circles, sometimes literally, around your aircraft. Well, we've got a little bit of a problem there. So there are such statements within the military record. They do exist. They're fascinating. And I think, we never, ever want to lose sight of that. It's very important to stay on what is the genuine documentation of this phenomenon. I've talked about it many times. Next, powerful implications. That is, the study of UFOs or UAP has profound implications for science, technology, obviously, politics, our society, our species, hell, our understanding of reality, all of that. It's very important. Next, there, let us say, strongly appear to be, what I think, grays and other types. Some of them are human looking. I really believe that. There are so many of these reports. And look, it's hard to set up a math equation and say, okay, that one is true, that one is false, this one is true, that one's not. It's hard to know. You've got people telling their recollection as best they can. But there, in my view, are many credible reports of these types of encounters that include sightings of grays. Think of the 1994 Ruwa, Zimbabwe, the school children case. We had 62 kids in a school. Very powerful witnesses, and to this day, now they're all in their 30s and 40s, they continue to make this statement. What they saw was true. Short gray aliens hovering right there in front of them. A couple of the kids were close enough to be able to touch them or shake hands with them. But that's just one case. There are many of these, I think, very potent and powerful cases of encounters with these beings. Many of them coming out in abduction testimony, again, by credible people. These are not pie in the sky, all fantasy. Some may be incorrect, some may be misrepresented, some may be lies. It's true, it's possible. But there's many of these. And once you start getting into the weeds, they become more and more difficult to dismiss. Next, collaboration. Okay, so I have a question mark here. We don't know, but is it possible, when we're thinking of this great unknown reality that is being concealed from us, well, how much is being concealed? Is there, as we have heard claims and allegations for a long time, collaboration, underground facilities, military involvement, humans with aliens, this type of thing? Is it true? Well, I don't know that is true. Can it be true? Oh, yes. Of course, it can be true. It absolutely can be true. Think about this. You have a phenomenon that has been heavy duty around our world on a daily basis for decades. Daily. And they're doing something. There have been some very excellent testimony now relating to our acquisition of their tech. Yes. And so, how far of a stretch is it to indicate that there may be communication in some way? Maybe collaboration, maybe just communication. Who knows? And then finally, what I would say is the likelihood of this subject being highly complex and strange. In other words, I think the full truth about UFOs or UAP is probably much more complex and strange than most of us realize. Potentially, let's say, in my opinion, probably involving multiple alien groups, very likely with different agendas. Strange, and they keep to themselves. We have seen this again and again. Occasional interactions, usually standoffish. There's an incredible reality that we, in our ignorance, we're not even thinking about this. Again, as I started out with this talk, we're not even really generally thinking much about the ignorance that we have of our own society, where we live under these illusions of, yes, I have free volition, I can free inquiry, and I'm a citizen in a free democratic society. Okay, well, we could tell ourselves whatever we want, but that I think is very much illusory. There's that, and then there's this level beyond that. So just imagine that in the shadows of this official world that we live within, this mundane world of ours, in those shadows there is a hidden reality behind that veil, behind that secrecy, where there are government agencies and military organizations that have been doing a little dance, a clandestine dance with beings from beyond our stars. And they've been doing this for decades, at least for decades. This is not science fiction. This is a truth stranger than probably any Hollywood script that I've ever seen. I don't think any movie has ever really been, has ever done justice to this reality. Just visualize the wreckage of an alien craft and its exotic materials under the lights of a classified laboratory, and you've got engineers and scientists staring at this thing, this incredible material, probably astonished, maybe a little afraid, going over this technology that just totally defies their understanding of what they thought they knew about physics. Is it possible that in deep underground bases you got humans and maybe non-humans working side by side? Why can't that be possible? Knowing that there's a reality to the phenomenon, an inexplicable nature to it, something incredibly advanced, well, someone is responsible for it, and it's probably not us. It's probably not us. In the meantime, we have whistleblowers and other truth tellers speaking of more than just exotic non-human tech and biologics, as David Grush called them. They talk about more than that. Sometimes they talk about abductions of genetic experiments and hybrids. And again, can this really be possible? Is this part of the reality? Don't know for sure, but would we be wise to rule it out? Should we be discounting this? We can't know everything that is happening, but is it wise to dismiss it simply because in our so-called free society, we can't get the highest level of proof that we think we demand? Ordinary citizens are pretty much outmatched, not just by our own governments and our own structures of power, but maybe we're outmatched by these other beings, right? You have to wonder about these beings. They clearly don't want to have an open conversation with us. And why should they? What makes us think that we're up for it? We love to think that we are so very advanced. Well, we know more than our ancestors did, yes, about many things. Yes, okay. So when we think about ancient societies, we can probably realize that maybe they couldn't handle the full truth about extraterrestrial visitation. Probably not. Probably not. I think that's right. It would very likely be traumatic for them. Okay, yes. But somehow we think we're all that different. So you think about it from the alien perspective. They might not think that we are all that able to handle the full reality of what they are, no matter how advanced we think we are. They probably aren't like our Hollywood movie scripts, just saying. They might be very, very different and possibly difficult to understand or accept. Just possible. There could be lots about this that we can handle. There can be. There probably is. But there might be a few zingers in there that just might cause us some consternation. So for many years, I have been fascinated, thinking, speculating, really, on the full, deeper scenario of what I think is actually going on. And it is all speculation. I acknowledge that. But what is the full nature of the secret? Of the reality? What is that? So I don't have a full answer here, but I do seriously doubt the beautiful utopian messages that still permeate the UFO, UAP cultural space here. You know, angelic beings here to elevate us somehow, to save us from ourselves somehow, change us, upgrade us, alien ex machina. Well, I think there's more than one type here. I can't say that I know this for sure, but that's what it looks like to me at any rate. It also looks like communication with these beings seems to transcend our understanding of language. It's the impression I get. Psychic links, consciousness-based exchanges, maybe? Yeah, maybe. Well, that sure opens up new frontiers of interaction. That certainly challenges our very concept of what it means to communicate. And all the while, our skies above us are just buzzing with activity. The interesting thing about our world today is that UFOs are no longer, well, first of all, they're not unidentified to those people with a clearance. They are, those people actually understand what's going on. They do all these maneuvers that defy our laws of physics. But today, it's not just military pilots, and it's not just, commercial pilots or anything like that. We are getting a lot of information from people having sightings around the world. We've been hearing a lot about New Jersey, but we're getting information from around the world. People seeing these things, and they are quite numerous. I've said many times what a big fan I am of the National UFO Reporting Center. Peter Davenport has run it for years, is someone very dear to me, but the site itself is a phenomenal repository of just raw reports that the public, you, anyone you know, can just submit. There's some nonsense in there. Peter's talked about this a number of times, but there's a lot of tremendous information in there. And every year, that site collects anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 new reports from around the world. And then there's MUFON. And I've been very fortunate in being able to get into the MUFON database as well. I've been permitted to look at that. Equal number of sightings there, probably. It's a lot. They get 5,000 to 10,000 a year as well, around the world, just like Newfork does. So the sightings are coming in from everywhere. And now, we're hearing about the so-called mystery drones, except a lot of those don't seem to be drones. Orbs, yeah. Craft of some sort, yes. Just as they have been for many years already. We have reports of orbs and other strange craft going back decades and decades. So there is a world behind the curtain. And I'm not saying that I can guess it with total accuracy, but we ought to keep thinking about it because there's something there. Probably a reality as breathtaking as it is terrifying. It's probably a little bit of both. Probably a truth that challenges everything we think we know about our world, to say nothing of our place in the universe. Probably a secret so profound that its revelation could reshape the very foundations of human society. And yet, for now, it remains hidden. Just a couple of people out there who really know the full depth, and maybe you could say who bear the full burden of this deep, deep secret. And meanwhile, the world just continues with its circus. New president, new shows on Netflix or Prime, new Super Bowl, new distractions on your feed coming at you every day. There's a massive reality going on around us, and we just stare at our screens, watching the never-ending blizzard of distractions coming at us. Indeed, algorithmically designed just for us. I try to wonder, what am I trying to get at here? And I guess it's just that truth-seeking is hard. The world throws distractions. Lies are easy. Truth is elusive. But the search does matter. We live in a sea of information, and most of it's noise. some is deliberate deception. And cutting through takes work. It takes discipline. And it's made harder when we convince ourselves that we actually possess the truth, that the information is readily available, that we are genuinely empowered to create change in a powerfully controlled society. We don't do ourselves favors with that illusion. And then, the journey inward, honestly, is just as tough. We lie to ourselves. We all know that. We avoid painful truths. It's easier. Life is easier that way, but it's not better. Real truth seeking changes you. It strips away illusions. It forces you to confront reality, which is not usually a pleasant thing. The good and the bad, the beautiful and the ugly. So I would say for you to keep doing it. You might not find all the answers. You probably won't, but you will find something else. You'll find yourself. You'll understand. You'll begin to understand who you are. That's valuable. It's a daily struggle, by the way. I'm sure many of you know this, against outside forces and against inner forces as well. Outside and inner weaknesses. But it's worth it because you wonder, what gives life meaning? Well, people have different answers to that, but one possibility, truth. Truth gives life meaning. It gives purpose. It gives freedom. So, seek after the truth as best you can, relentlessly, fearlessly. It won't solve everything, but it will make you whole. And in this fractured world, that means something. That's not trivial. Well, that's me for today. I hope you've enjoyed hanging out with me for a little while. I will be back again. If you like this video, please do hit the like, share, and subscribe buttons. Do check out my website at richardolanmembers.com. We have a great community there. And don't forget to keep fighting the good fight. Later.